made.
These bad actors were banned days before any of this drama happened. Now, this is a person, I actually didn't know who this was. So this is the same person who's trying to get me in trouble on Twitch. Let's listen to what they had to say about everybody's favorite commentator, Destiny.
Hey, the guy who said it was on site at TwitchCon if he saw Destiny.
What if I want the satisfaction?
I mean, listen.
Yes.
All I'm saying is on site, you know.
So we have on screen two radical political activists, which is probably the most kind way that I can categorize these two individuals, that are arguing between which of them is going to be able to beat up Destiny when they're at TwitchCon. And they're openly doing this on Twitch. The point that I'm making is that these are people who are advocating for violence on a regular basis, and this is something that happened, again, this was earlier this month. This is the same person who, as a response to a video about a CEO, posted a picture right here of the gun that was used to kill Shinzo Abe. So this is a person that not only is advocating for violence against other streamers, but they're advocating for violence against other people in general. This should not be tolerated in any capacity. If you are advocating for or promoting the use of violence against people in a non-self-defensive way, I think you should get banned. These are the people who are trying, and by the way, I wasn't even talking about burning down the Institute, I was talking about the book burning, so you didn't even listen to the clip. You're talking about something totally different. And so these are people who have been on a concerted effort to misrepresent me on a regular basis, while at the same time allowing and facilitating and promoting political violence. This is something that is guaranteed 100% against the terms of service. We'll go over, of course, obviously, Hassan also had to chirp about this as well. He was not happy about it. It's a bit of a miss. Like, my understanding is that they burned them not because it was gender stuff, but because it was written in Jewish and not German.
This is Democracy Watch. Mark, over the last few weeks, we have seen a number of lawsuits land in front of these federal judges against the Trump administration, but we have a much different one here that could pose particular problems for Donald Trump and Elon Musk personally. Can you explain what these lawsuits are about?
Yeah, this is one of the most important lawsuits we're going to see. I know there have been a sea of lawsuits. Democracy Docket is tracking several dozens of them, but this is one to watch because, as you point out, it is brought by 14 states, and it is suing, in addition to suing Doge, it is suing Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And here's why. What it says is that that Elon Musk is essentially exercising the power of what the Supreme Court refers to as a principal officer. Think cabinet officials, right? These are the highest rung of government officials in the executive branch. And it turns out, you know, not that Donald Trump probably reads the Constitution, but it turns out there's actually a provision of the U.S. Constitution that says that officers of the United States, like I said, the Supreme Court calls principal officers, they have to be nominated by the president. They have to be confirmed by the Senate. They can't just be like any random person. They can't just be like a random billionaire who the president likes. And that is because of separation of powers, right? It is what's referred to as the Appointments Clause. And it says that this is how these folks get appointed and can exercise this power. So this could slam the brakes on basically everything Elon Musk is doing if it were successful.
In terms of having personal liability here, what would this lawsuit do? Would it seek to impose any consequences against Elon, or just kind of squeeze him out of the process that he's pretty much taken control of?
Yeah, it would squeeze him out of the process, right? He's not being sued for money or anything like that. The goal here is to say, look, Donald Trump, if you want a principal officer of the United States, if you want a cabinet department, go to Congress. Right? Congress can create the agency. You can then submit Elon Musk's name to the U.S. Senate. The Senate could have confirmation hearings. The Senate could exercise its advise and consent role. And then, you know, you'll have Secretary of Doge Elon Musk, but you haven't done any of that. Like, none of that's happened. Instead, you have set up a de facto head that has all of this power that we would normally attribute to a senior official,
right.
And yet he hasn't gone through any of that process. So it would halt that. And I think the assumption by these states is if you halt that for Elon Musk, you essentially prevent Doge as an entity from wielding the kind of power it does.
And so what kind of an impact would that have on the agencies where Doge has already kind of interfered in their processes? What kind of an impact would that have on CFPB? What kind of an impact would that have on Treasury, on USAID?
Yeah, so look, it would declare all of that stuff illegal, or at least put a serious question over it. But we have to be realistic here, Brian, which is that Doge is a big part of the problem. And as I said, this is one of the most important cases for that reason, because without Elon Musk, I'm not sure there is a Doge. But, you have increasingly Trump taking over the other senior parts of the government. You have his OMB director now confirmed and in place. You have Pam Bondi confirmed and in place at the Department of Justice. You have Pete Hegseth confirmed and in place at the Department of Defense. You have Tulsi Gabbard confirmed and in place at the Director of National Intelligence. So, it is not clear to me that the terrible policies that we are seeing out of these departments and agencies would reverse. It would probably, like I said, it would certainly slow things up, because a lot of it does seem to be driven by Elon Musk. But, let's be clear, Marco Rubio, who, the legacy media proclaimed as a no-brainer to confirm for Secretary of State, this was a responsible and serious man. Well, what has he done? He is now nominally the head of USAID, and he's going along with shutting down USAID. So again, yes, it is probably in one of the top 3 most important pieces of litigation right now for everyone to follow. But, until we contend with the full broad side of attacks that are coming, it won't stop the problem.
Mark, is there any worry that if this lawsuit is successful and Elon is prevented from being able to do what he's doing with Doge until he's confirmed as some type of cabinet level or high level administration official, that ultimately it will serve as a bump in the road, but Whereas, to your exact point, Congress is perfectly content to contract their power to Trump. If Trump does go ahead and ask Mike Johnson to go ahead and confirm Elon Musk, and John Thune in the Senate to confirm Elon Musk, that they'll be perfectly content to do it because Trump asked.
Yeah, except here's the problem. Elon Musk is getting the benefit right now of not being an officer of the United States, right? He is exempt in his current status from, for example, filing a disclosure statement of his financial holdings. He is not subject to all of the rules and regulations involving conflicts of interest that would be applied. And so I think that is on purpose. I think that Elon Musk would not, in fact, be willing to subject himself to all of those requirements. And also, I don't think the White House is so confident that they'd actually be able to set up a new agency, right? Because setting up a new agency would require not just votes in the House, and there would be Republicans in the House who don't want to expand the number of agencies. They want to contract the number of agencies. So you might lose some Republican votes. I don't think you'd pick up any Democratic votes. And in the Senate, it would be filibusterable because it is the creation of a new entity. So I think that this lawsuit is really important because it actually could mean a really big change.
With that said, let's say, again, using this thought experiment, that the lawsuit is successful and all of the changes that Elon oversaw are reversed. The reality is that these agencies are shriveling right now just by virtue of atrophy, of the fact that a lot of these people have been told they're fired or not showing up. A lot of them, I'm sure, are getting new jobs. And so we could be in a process, where, this whole process sees its way through the court system, and in weeks or months, or probably at the worst part of this, years, they are allowed back in. But won't the damage have already been done just by virtue of the amount of time that's passed and the crippling effect that will have?
Yes, it will. And I think we all need to be realistic about this. The fact is that there has been immeasurable damage already done to our federal government, and we are only weeks into the Trump administration. There has been tremendous damage done to the rule of law, and we are only weeks into the Trump administration. And it is going to get worse. The lawsuits that are being filed are not the solution to the crisis of democracy. They are buying time for democracy. They are buying us more time. They are slowing down the bad things. But in the end of the day, this is not going to be something that the courts themselves can stop from happening. We're going to need Congress to be responsible. We're going to need the American people to act courageously. We're going to need more courage, like we saw, frankly, from the lawyers in the Southern District of New York, who didn't just resign, but they did so publicly. They did so loudly. So, like, I'm not here to say that this is one of the most important cases and it is a cure-all. I'm here to say it's one of the most.
His videos
Donald
feel so
Trump
hollow,
held
you know what I'm
a
saying?
disastrous press
Speaking about
conference
hollow
with
people,
Indian
but at least
Prime
these ones
Minister
are short.
Modi, and it once again was a total supplication to Vladimir Putin, confirming Trump is going to let him do whatever the hell he wants. Trump was asked a question that we saw Pete Hegseth asked earlier. Ukraine is being asked to make a lot of concessions here. What about Russia? Should Russia give anything up? And Trump's answer is that Russia has already suffered because it hasn't been that easy for them to win this war. Well, maybe they shouldn't have gotten into it in the first place.
To the Russia-Ukraine war, you've suggested several things. Lose the whole thing.
Oh, I dropped a little, didn't I? Huh? I'll come back. No, it's good. We're good. It's back. Yeah. It's funny. I noticed you saying F before I noticed the drop.
Under Trump, they lost nothing. Ukraine lost nothing. They didn't give up anything. And you take a look at the other three presidents surrounding me, they gave up a lot.
So this is typical Trump. What is it that Russia would have to give up here to get to peace? Well, they've already given stuff up because it's been a tough war for them. Yes, an invasion that they started. Praying
I'm ready
at
for
the
the NATO
altar
conference.
of Vladimir Putin. At another point during this thing, Donald Trump couldn't understand an Indian reporter. And the guy
part
tried
was
twice
so
and Trump just
good.
goes, I can't understand a word you're saying.
President, people in India will naturally welcome your decision to extradite Thabu Rana to India back home. In that context, I'd like to ask you a question about, in last few years, we have seen several groups in the U.S. raising anti-India voice, calling about separation, terrorism activities in India. Do you think that should continue here in the U.S. as well?
You can go louder.
Mr. President, people in India would be welcoming your decision to extradite Thabu Rana to...
I can't understand a word he's saying. It's not it's the accent.
Listen, I have two thoughts about this, right? I get telemarketing calls all the time from overseas. And it could be India, it could be the Philippines, there's all sorts of places. And I've had situations where I say, I don't know where you're calling from, what you're offering, what you're asking me. I don't know what you're saying. So on the one hand, that's a real thing. On the other hand, it's also true that
when
yesterday
the
was
summit
a
happens, I'll be
representation
watching.
of just about every day with Trump with this stuff, which is he was rude to Caitlin Collins, a female reporter, and he was rude to this guy, an Indian reporter. The theme seems to be, remember when he was rude to Weijia Jiang back during the previous administration with COVID-related stuff with regard to her being Asian and Trump calling it the Kung flu and all of this stuff. And the theme is that he's always dismissive and rude and just kind of a dick to individuals with identities that
Weird
are
way to
other
say
than
funny, David.
white men. That's the theme. And also, listen, I understand speaking to someone and having absolutely no idea what they're talking to you. Okay, and then speaking about having no idea what they're talking about, as difficult as apparently the Indian reporter was for Trump to understand, does anyone understand this from Trump?
This is where it seems to be heading. And artificial intelligence, complex a very complex subject, but it seems to be where people want to be and they want to go, and we're leading right now by a lot, but other people will try to catch us. I don't know if they're going to be able to. We're going to make those.
That's just classic Trump. That's how he always sounds.
Easier to understand than what the Indian reporter was saying. So another
it is because I'm used to it.
Humiliating press conference, but maybe not as humiliating for the country as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. now being the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Well, I wrote a book after a long journey and a ton of work. I am really thrilled with how it turned out, and I hope you'll read it.
I bet it's thrilling.
Machine.
I bet it's just as exciting as you,
EFF
Dave.
leader Julius Malema has sent a stern warning to U.S. President Donald Trump and his ally tech billionaire Elon Musk. He says he's not deterred by Musk's call for him to be declared an international criminal, and says he won't be bullied to change his views on land expropriation without compensation. Newsroom Africa's Junior Kumalo reports.
EFF leader Julius Malema has made it clear that he will not be intimidated by both U.S. President Donald Trump and his ally Elon Musk. Malema's utterances come after Musk called for the Red Berets leader to be declared an international criminal and for sanctions to be imposed against the EFF leader.
I'm so happy to be an international criminal. You know why? Because Nelson Mandela was an international criminal. That's what they declared him, for fighting for the freedom of our people. Why do you make me an international criminal for asking for dignity of black people? I've not committed any crime against anyone except to say, let's restore the dignity of black person.
Malema reiterated that there was no truth to Musk's claims that he is calling for a white genocide.
In that auction, 95% of those people were white people. I sat with them from 11 o'clock until 6 in the evening, wanting to demonstrate to Elon Musk and Donald Trump that I'm with the people you are saying I want to kill.
Alien Musk.
Why would I sit with these white people if I want to kill them?
Staying with geopolitical matters, Malema has called out the South African government for how it dealt with the death of 14 SANDF soldiers in the Eastern DRC.
After 14 soldiers were killed, we said bring them back home. They did not bring them back home. They sent more 800 soldiers. But the ones that are remaining in DRC, they are no longer in a camp, Murut, Bishop. They are not in a camp. They are being held hostage. Yes, they for them to go to a toilet, they must get a permission from M23.
Days after his party's former national spokesperson followed in the footsteps of former EFF deputy president and other leaders by announcing his exit from the Red Berets, Malema maintains he will not be deterred.
I lost my brothers now, turned against me. And I never looked back. I've never, not even once, doubted myself when my brothers turned against me.
As the EFF goes through rebuilding, following numerous challenges, Malema has declared 2025 the year of the picket lines and reconnecting with communities. For Newsroom Africa on Channel 405, I'm Junior Kumalo in Mulitsane in Soweto.
It's my pleasure to welcome General David Petraeus
Let's
to
go!
the Sacred Studio, coming to
Let's
us
go!
live at this moment from Munich, where,
The king.
sir, it's been a rather different, rather emotional conference. What are your big takeaways?
Well, there has been no shortage of drama here. There's been a degree of excitement that isn't always present by any means here in Munich. And I just say, by the way, we miss not having you and Brad here with us, but it's great to be able to connect in this way.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I think some of the headlines, I know that Ukraine is a very important topic to you. We have had the pleasure of traveling to Ukraine with you 7 or 8 times over the last couple of years. Big news that Ukraine did not get the security guarantees that it needs, as sort of some of these details are falling into place about talks. We understand at this point and we know things are changing quickly, that Europeans are not
Where
expected
is
to
his
get
secretary?
to the first round. Talk to us a little bit about the significance of this, and maybe more importantly, what you think the impact will be on any kind of future security agreement for Ukraine.
Well, first of all, I think there will be a security guarantee. I think there has to be a security guarantee. The question is what it will look like, whether a U.S. commander might be dual-hatted in leading it, or if it will be led by Europeans. It's that kind of question, I think. There has to be a security guarantee. I can't imagine that Ukraine could agree to anything that did not include a robust security guarantee. The question is what could be in it, just beyond a military response. Could it include, for example, automatic seizure of the $300 billion of Russian assets sitting in European banks? Could it include an automatic path to NATO membership for Ukraine? All of this in addition to whatever the military action might be taken by probably a coalition of the willing. In an ideal world, it would be a NATO operation led by
that's my trigger word.
3-star, let's say, with a core headquarters that is then built into a NATO coalition headquarters with lots of European and U.S. assets in place to provide the response. By the way, one of the interesting elements has been a sense based on Secretary of Defense Hegseth's comments that the U.S. might not have boots on the ground in Ukraine. As I've thought about that, that's sort of old NATO. That's what we used to do in the Cold War days. In fact, as a second lieutenant, I was a rifle platoon leader in an airborne battalion in Vicenza, Italy. We were actually going to jump in to parts of NATO where there were not large NATO forces, say Eastern Turkey, the Turkish Thrace, but where the Soviet Union could come into NATO territory, literally to make sure, I guess, that we were going to die and bring the U.S. into the fight. You don't need to do that. The Ukrainians have a very substantial force on the ground. They can prevent any rapid Russian offensive from achieving much, just as they have been for many, many months, albeit giving up incremental elements of ground. The real question is, could you have an architecture that's essentially a NATO or, again, U.S. or coalition of the willing kill chain? Could you have lots of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets over Ukraine, tied into the
Can I get the
Ukrainian
link to this vid?
intelligence
Yes, hang
system
on.
at close link there, so that you absolutely know
the social development
and if the Russians come across whatever demilitarized zone might be established, or shoot across it, in which case, again, it would trigger some kind of response that could be with long-range assets from NATO soil. The 3 Baltic states, perhaps Eastern Poland, maybe even Romania. And
Could
of course,
be
we
louder,
have
you know what I'm
forces
saying?
already in the Baltic states and in Eastern Poland as well. So the question is, what would the architecture of this be? But as I've thought about it, it doesn't trouble me that much that there would not be U.S. boots on the ground. So I think this, of course, will be the subject of enormous internal discussion with European NATO partners, with the Ukrainians, and so forth. But there has to be a security guarantee. I think it's the most important element of whatever negotiated outcome is agreed.
Yeah,
Beyond that,
go ahead, sir.
Beyond that, again, some moments of real drama here, if you will. I was at the lunch yesterday, the Ukraine lunch, at which General Kellogg, retired 3-star, who has been named the envoy, but said that the Europeans would not be at the negotiating table. And in fact, as we have learned since then, the first negotiations will be in Saudi Arabia. The negotiators will actually not include General Kellogg. They'll be the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and then Special Envoy Witkoff. And then again, we'll see where it goes from there. But there was a bit of, the question was asked several times, so you mean the Europeans will not be at that? Now, to be fair, having...
Y'all gotta see this fucking thumbnail from Kyle Kalinske here. Hang on. Look at this. Ah. Where'd it go? There she is. Isn't that fucking awesome? Look at that Trump thumbnail. Oh no, it not show up because the window capture above it. There we go. He's like Dracula. Like, what a great thumbnail.
"31 other countries or however many at the table is more than a bit unwieldy. But perhaps at some point there could be a thought about a contact group such as we have seen before, where the U.S. has at the table, say, the EU High Rep, the UK, Germany, France, maybe Italy, something like that. But again, we'll see how this aspect of this plays out. General Kellogg apparently is going to interface with the Ukrainians, Witkoff with the Russians, but it's all happening very, very rapidly. In fact, General Kellogg said this is on Trump time, meaning that it's all the catalyst of Trump's impatience is very much at play here. And there were a number of other moments of degree of drama. The vice president's speech about the state of democracy.
I agree. It is a repeat. I've said it. I think I said it before that it's a repeat of the Doha talks. Absolutely, 100%. Crazy, 100%, for sure.
Europe, and then just meeting with the far right German candidate for, 27 minutes supposedly, and then the leading candidate who's not in power, Friedrich Merz, with 3 minutes and not at all with the German chancellor who pushed back in his speech the subsequent day, and so forth. So there's been a lot of, again, diplomatic drama played out here over the weekend that is a bit unique in my experience of coming here almost continuously for the last 12 years, but at the very first time as the speechwriter for the NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe back when I was a major a number of decades ago when the Cold War was still quite threatening.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cypher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now.
Okay. Conspiracy theory time. They laid out this entire video and then balanced it for YouTube loudness. So only this ad in the center that was actually peaking louder than the video itself is the correct loudness.
Now at cypherbriefhonors.com.
And the venue for the Munich Security Conference is not huge, so I can imagine the reverberations from this have been rather significant. It seems to be also a moment of reckoning, as I think you've mentioned, for European leaders who are now thinking differently about their own defense. Is that also what you're talking about?
Yeah, very much so. Again, I've watched, keep in mind, by the way, I was a NATO officer, if you will, or dual-hatted U.S. and NATO as a 1-star, 3-star, 4-star, in addition to the earlier assignments as a young officer, then a field grade officer, and so on. I've watched, therefore, as frustrated presidents or vice presidents or secretaries of defense rail away at the inadequate portion of GDP spent on defense by European nations, while noting that there have never been as many as right now that actually do meet the 2% of GDP on defense that was agreed way back a couple of decades ago at the Wales summit. But clearly enormous.
You know how generals get romanticized over time? I'm wondering how long it will take until people realize that Petraeus was the greatest general of the modern era for the United States. We're in postmodern, of course, as Jordan Peterson tells us. No, but seriously, with MAGA here, we're definitely postmodern. I kept saying it was going to be the end of the new party system, but here I was thinking that it was the MAGA hats that were going to fucking collapse because they were too crazy.
Enormous pressure on them to do more. A recognition, the Secretary General of NATO, that it's probably going to have to be 3%, north of 3%, I think was the term that he used, and so forth. So that, I think there is a stark element in that regard that has never been as pointed and direct and so forth as it was here. Of course, the big threat, the real reason, the real catalyst for additional spending in recent years has not just been that President Obama or Biden or Trump 1 or Bush even was pushing them to spend more. It's the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. First, the occupation of territory in 2014, then the full-scale invasion, of course, now almost 3 years ago.
Yeah. And of course, they've added members as well since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Let me ask you for a moment. We were in Ukraine with you last September, and people already were starting to understand they were going to have to give up things they didn't want to give up in order to end this war. There was this reality kind of sinking in. But Ukraine has made incredible advances on the technology front, on the innovation front. You also wear your KKR hat, and you think about the future of investment in defense technology. What do you think that future looks like for Ukraine? Because once a deal is finally reached, they still have a lot to build on, don't they?
They have it. This will be the military-industrial colossus of Europe. And by the way, I'm going in again from here. I go to Warsaw tonight and then overnight into Ukraine and spend the week there as they approach the 3-year anniversary of the launching of the full-scale invasion 2022. And you'll recall when we visited the Nemesis Battalion on our last trip, how extraordinary is the partnership and unique is the partnership between those who design the unmanned system. So it's not just aerial drones, it's also maritime drones that have sunk 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet and forced the final Russian ship out of the centuries-occupied port of Sevastopol in Crimea. It is ground systems now. Of course, back in December, the Ukrainians conducted the first ever complete unmanned systems attack. It's never been done in history that we know of. All remotely operated aerial and various ground robotic systems and vehicles. So again, this is a system. Now, of course, nothing concentrates the mind like the prospect of losing your independence, fighting for your very survival. But this is a system that they have that now produces tomorrow's technology.
He got a monster in the cave.
And I don't think it's overly too hyperbolic to say that our procurement system, especially for major items, tends to produce yesterday's technology for tomorrow's wars. In fact, we absolutely have to overhaul our system, noting that there are vested interests in the military-industrial congressional complex, as Senator McCain used to describe it, that are want to continue to have existing platforms, existing basing arrangements, existing manufacturing and maintenance and all the rest of that. So we should be learning much more rapidly from this. They are on the cutting edge of technology. You'll recall when we were with the Nemesis Battalion, this is all unclassified. They actually have a website you can go to, shows their greatest hits from the era and so forth. These are all the tech bros of Ukraine are now in this ecosystem. They're either designing, manufacturing, or actually employing these particular systems. And they're iterating not just with software, as the Russian jammers or electronic warfare or air defense or other countermeasures are employed. They're changing hardware on a weekly or bi-weekly basis as well. It's really something that has to be seen to be appreciated. And as you recall, the systems they're producing are really very capable and yet very cheap, relative speaking, to our suicide drones or our out and back drones and so forth. The latest adaptation, Suzanne, which is really interesting, is that they're avoiding the jamming. They're literally rolling out fiber optic cable, very, very thin, very light, and so forth, from the drone as it goes out so that they can maintain communications, command and control.
That's fucking awesome.
Visual picture and so forth. That's how they're getting around the increasingly effective Russian electronic warfare posture, jamming, air defense, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And when we were there with you, I found it fascinating that Ukraine has the ability to manufacture far more drones than it is able to currently, and potentially with the end of the war, will then be able to export that drones. Can you kind of connect that for
Sure.
me to the fact that you see them becoming a powerhouse?
They could do that now if they had the money and the orders. President Zelensky initially, I think wisely, said, we're not going to export anything. We're going to use it on our battlefield. And as you recall, they are throwing thousands of suicide drones at the Russians on the front lines every day. There are hundreds more that are going out and coming back, at least for 12 or 15 missions until they're shot down. There are dozens going into Russian airspace every night, going after the Russian energy refineries, the storage locations, sometimes strategic airfields, and so on. So this is how they are overcoming being very heavily outmanned and outgunned, and also inflicting extraordinary casualties on the Russians. And the Russians also can't replace the hardware now that they're losing, the armored systems and so on. They're already well into the old stocks that they had that have been refurbished and brought back on the battlefield. And they just can't. They're actually now, in many cases, just using infantry for the attacks. And of course, probably reflecting their concern about whether they can continue to recruit Russian men willing to go into this very lethal battlefield. They actually have had 10,000 North Koreans on the battlefield in Kursk, that area in Russia that Ukraine attacked into and still holds half of what it was they seized.
It's so funny.
And those
they
North
still
Koreans
got
have been
shit
absolutely
inside
slaughtered.
Russia, bro.
So very, very lethal battlefield. Ukraine on the cutting edge of this technology, way beyond where we are, frankly, in its ability to. They produced 1.5 million drones in the first 9 months of last year, according to President Zelensky. And they could actually export now if they had the money and the orders, and that would help them actually make money and then buy more drones. But when the guns fall silent, the capacity here is going to be the most extraordinary in the world. If you look at the numbers of what we've provided, usually it was hundreds or maybe small numbers of thousands of suicide drones in total, and realize that they're throwing thousands of drones at the Russians every single day. This is really quite stunning. It is the future of warfare in many respects, albeit a lot of differences to the potential scenarios in which we might be involved with our coalition partners.
I'm fascinated by that, and I've been asking you for the last 2 years now what you think it will take, once again, with your KKR hat on, in sort of determining when it's safe to have foreign investment come into Ukraine and really start investing heavily in their manufacturing capabilities and their ability to export some of these things to the rest of the world and essentially really grow. And you kept saying, not quite yet, Suzanne, not quite yet, Suzanne. I wonder if you think the time is getting much closer now that we may see an end to this war.
Well, I think it is much closer. And as you know, since you're co-hosting, albeit remotely, with Brave One, this gathering in Kyiv next week that I'll attend and at which I'll speak, of Ukrainian tech companies, they're ready to take investment. And I think it will probably be the more of the lower end of the venture capital, growth tech, that kind of investor initially. And then over time, you'll get the large investors who are looking for huge deals. But it's going to require the guns to fall silent, I think. But by the way, many other attractive opportunities. The minerals are in bold relief right now after President Trump floated an idea that Ukraine would sign over $500 billion worth of strategic minerals and so forth to the U.S. in return for the, whatever it is, couple hundred billion that they've actually gotten from the U.S. Keep in mind that much of these aid packages has actually been spent in the U.S. To replenish our own stocks with more modern munitions after we have given Ukraine what we had on hand. So, again, I think there are going to be incredible opportunities here. Let's not forget the agriculture. They're somewhere in the order of 20 or more percent of grain exports, not grain production, but exports. And by the way, the clearing out of the Russian Black Sea fleet from the Western Black Sea, forced by this combination of aerial and maritime Ukrainian drones, has meant that they're once again able to export to countries like Egypt and North Africa and other North African countries that are so highly dependent on Ukraine for their very food security.
Mm-hmm. So I would say, sir, as you're heading into Ukraine this week, let me just ask you, you'll be keeping an eye, obviously, on the talks in Saudi Arabia that are expected now to happen. What are the indicators that you're going to see that Ukraine might be getting security guarantees that it needs out of those talks? What will you be watching for?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, just the commitment to a security guarantee. Then, over time, what form
I think Petraeus does better outside of America.
Be?
I think he's a little too
will it be not just
serious
military activity
and kind of dull? I think he'd do well in Europe audiences, but
again, it doesn't actually have to come from Ukrainian soil. It could come from outside.
You know, General Schwarzkopf is like the guy when it comes to fucking
incorporate again a commitment to
press
NATO membership
tours
for
and
Ukraine
stuff. You know,
if their sovereignty is once again
nothing
violated.
compares to the Gulf War media.
Consist of again all of the 300 billion being seized or some increment of that. There's a number of different combinations and permutations to this, but that, in my mind, if I were a leader in Ukraine, that's what really matters. I mean, we know the other contours probably will consist of Russia continuing to occupy 20% or so of Ukrainian territory. But by the way, what do they do about Ukrainian occupation of that part of Kursk? But again, the broad contours, I think you can actually envision demilitarized zones, ceasefire, etc. It's the security guarantee that really matters.
I don't know if Schwarzkopf is even around anymore, you know?
The focus of Ukrainian leaders in particular.
Yeah. Brad Christian did an excellent interview yesterday with Bill Browder about the seizing of that Russian fund, of Russian funds in general. Let me ask you, sir, closing thoughts for you from Munich. As you mentioned right off the top, it's been somewhat of an exciting one, maybe not always in positive ways exciting, but a lot of buzz there. What are your closing thoughts?
By the way, first, I just met with Bill Browder, and we were discussing exactly what we've just been discussing here. There's been sort of a wave of emotions here. There's some stunned Europeans at various times, a bit of disbelief about this and that. But as you then think it through and realize this and other realities could really lead the Europeans to doing more for their own defense, which is a long time in coming, this could actually bring about a ceasefire in Ukraine. You could fashion a security guarantee that doesn't require U.S.
Schwarzkopf died in 2012.
On the ground in Ukraine.
And let's not forget that he fucking is responsible for poisoning our own soldiers. So he is no Petraeus either.
Perhaps, there have been pluses and minuses, but there always are. There's always a degree of drama here. But this seemed to have more than the ordinary amount of that quality.
I'm certain of that. General David Petraeus, it's always such a pleasure. We're so grateful for your time in helping us put this into context. I think you've given us some bright spots to look forward to in a sea of otherwise pretty dour headlines at the moment. Sir, thank you. We're wishing you safe travels.
Privileged to be with you as always, Suzanne, and privileged to be one of your cipher brief experts.
Thank you so much.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is in Jerusalem on the second leg of his trip through Europe and the Middle East. Mr. Secretary, I know it's the evening hours there and you've had a long day. We appreciate your time. You've got quite a busy schedule. You met earlier with Prime Minister Netanyahu. He said he's lockstep with the Trump administration, but he can't share details on, quote, when the gates of hell will be open if all of our hostages are not released. Did he tell you he wants to keep talks going to get to phase 2 of this hostage deal?
Well, I think we share a common goal. We want to see every hostage released. Frankly, I think, and the president has said this, we want to see him out as soon as we possibly can. And certainly, the world has watched these images of people, and it's just heartbreaking to remember that some of them have been now almost 2 years there. It's a horrifying situation. So we coordinate and work very close with them. We share the goal that every hostage needs to come home, every single one, without delay. Obviously, the There are details of how we're pursuing that and coordinating that we're not going to share publicly because we don't want to endanger the hostages and we don't want to endanger this process. But suffice it to say that if it was up to us, every one of these hostages would be home right now, and we want it to happen as soon as possible.
Okay, so the deal stands.
Again, we want every hostage out as soon as possible. We want to see them home. There are some that are supposed to, under the deal, there are some that are supposed to be released coming up next weekend. We expect that to happen, but we'd like to see them all come out. We're not in favor of waiting weeks and weeks. Now, that may be the process that's in place because of the deal, but we would like to see them all out as soon as possible. And we continue to coordinate. That's what we'd like to see is the outcome. Who wouldn't want all these hostages to be home and with their families?
Understood. I want to ask you about Iran as well. President Trump has said he wants a diplomatic deal with Iran. Are you reaching out to them? And alongside that, does the U.S. support a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran to take out its nuclear program?
Well, first of all, Israel will always have to act in what they believe is their national interest and their national defense. And so I'm not going to speak about whatever strategies they may have on this or any other topic. I will say that we don't have any outreach from Iran. We haven't seen any. And ultimately, we've seen in the past that efforts that Iran has undertaken diplomatically have been only about how to extend the time frame but continue to enrich and in addition to sponsor terrorism, in addition to build these long-range weapons, in addition to sow instability throughout the region. But let's be clear, there's been zero outreach or interest to date from Iran about any negotiated deal. Ideally, yeah, I would love to wake up one day and hear the news that Iran has decided not to pursue a nuclear weapon, not to sponsor terrorism, and re-engage in the world as a normal government. We've had no indication of any of that, not just now, but for 30 years.
So you head from Israel to Saudi Arabia next. I know you'll be talking about Gaza, but we've also learned that Saudi Arabia is trying to facilitate this diplomacy with Russia about Ukraine.
Fucking James
Which
earlier
Russian
on the series
officials
like,
do you
if Saudi
expect to
Arabia
be
could,
meeting
it would
with,
kill
and
every
what
single
will the focus
Palestinian
of
in
your
Gaza.
talks there be? Do you actually believe Vladimir Putin is ready to negotiate and make concessions?
Well, here's what I know. I know President Trump spoke to Vladimir Putin last week, and in it, Vladimir Putin expressed his interest in peace, and the president expressed his desire to see an end to this conflict in a way that was enduring and that protected Ukrainian sovereignty, and that was an enduring peace, not that we're going to have another invasion in 3 or 4 years. That's a good call. Now, obviously, it has to be followed up by action. So the next few weeks and days will determine whether it's serious or not. Ultimately, one phone call does not make peace. One phone call does not solve a war as complex as this one. But I can tell you that Donald Trump is the only leader in the world that could potentially begin that process. Other leaders have tried. They have not been able to do so. When he ran in his campaign and he was elected as president, one of his promises was he would work to bring an end to this conflict in a way that's sustainable and fair. And obviously, this is the first step in that process, but we have a long ways to go. Again, one call doesn't make it. One meeting wouldn't make it. There's a lot of work to be done. But I thought it has, even the longest journey begins with the first step. So we'll see what happens from here. Hopefully good things.
Who will you be meeting with?
Well, nothing's been finalized yet. I was scheduled to be in Saudi Arabia anyways. We announced that trip a week ago and a week and a half ago. So ultimately, look, if at any point in time there's an opportunity to continue the work that President Trump started last week to begin to create an opening for a broader conversation, that it would involve Ukraine and would involve the end of the war and would involve our allies all over the world, particularly in Europe, we're going to explore it if that opportunity presents itself. I don't have any details for you this morning other than to say that we stand ready to follow the president's lead on this and begin to explore ways, if those opportunities present itself, to begin a process towards peace. Now, a process towards peace is not a one-meeting thing. This war has been going on for a while. Right. It's difficult. It's complicated. It's been bloody. It's been costly. So it will not be easy to end a conflict like this. And there are other parties at stake that have opinions on this as well. The European Union has sanctions as well. The Ukrainians are obviously fighting this war. It's their country and they're on the front lines. So one meeting isn't going to solve it. But I want to reiterate, the president made clear he wants to end this war. And if opportunities present themselves to further that, we're going to take them if they present themselves. We'll see what happens over the next few days.
But to be clear, Keith Kellogg, who is the envoy appointed to help with these talks, says these are going to be parallel negotiations, meaning the Ukrainians and Russians aren't talking to each other yet. When you meet with your Russian counterpart, whoever that is, are you going to be sitting there arguing Ukraine's position?
Well, first of all, I think that we have to understand is right now there is no process. What we have right now is a call between Putin and President Trump in which both sides expressed an interest in ending this conflict. I mean, imagine there will be follow-up conversations to figure out what a process to talk about that would look like. And then at that point, perhaps we can begin to share more details. So it's a bit premature. I know there's been a lot of reaction to it because there's been no conversation about it, any serious conversation. But I want to go back to the point I made. President Trump ran. He was very clear. He thinks this war needs to end. And if he sees an opportunity to end it, which is what he's looking for, whether there is an opportunity or not, we're going to pursue it. Ultimately, it will reach a point when if it's real negotiations, and we're not there yet, but if that were to happen, Ukraine will have to be involved because they're the one that were invaded. And the Europeans will have to be involved because they have sanctions on Putin and Russia as well. And they've contributed to this effort. We're just not there yet. We really aren't. But hopefully we will be, because we'd all like to see this war end.
No doubt. The last administration did have contact through the intelligence agencies with Russia, but they didn't believe there was any proof that Vladimir Putin was interested in talks. You know the history with Vladimir Putin. He likes to use diplomacy as a cover to distract while he continues to wage war. Do you trust that this time is different?
Yeah, I don't think in geopolitics anyone should trust anyone. I think these things have to be verified through actions. I said yesterday that peace is not a noun, it's a verb, it's an action. You have to take concrete steps towards it. What I can tell you is I know of no better negotiator in American politics than President Trump. Yeah. I think President Trump will know very quickly whether this is a real thing or whether this is an effort to buy time. But I don't want to prejudge that. I don't want to foreclose the opportunity to end a conflict that's already cost the lives of hundreds of thousands and continues every single day to be increasingly a war of attrition on both sides. I think everyone should be celebrating the fact that we have an American president that is seeking to promote peace in the world, not start wars, but end them in a way that's enduring. That's something we should be happy about, whether it's possible or not. We're certainly willing, but it's not entirely up to us, obviously, but we'll find out.
Well, you did speak in a phone call with Russia's top diplomat, Sergei Lavrov. The Russian side claimed that you discussed restoring trade, which seemed to be a nod to sanctions, easing restrictions on diplomats, and other gestures like a high-level leaders meeting. Are you actually considering, is the Trump administration considering lifting sanctions on Russia?
Well, the phone call was to establish communications that are consistent with the call the president made last week with Vladimir Putin, because if there is going to be the possibility of progress here towards peace, we are going to need to talk to the Russians. I mean, that is going to have to happen, and we're going to have to be able to do it across our channels.
I
also raised in that conversation concerns that. Well, we didn't go into any details. I mean, what we just discussed is basically the ability to begin communicating. I've never spoken to Mr. Lavrov in my life, so it was an opportunity for us to begin to open that channel of communication, which again, if there's the potential for peace here, that's a channel that has to exist. But let me add one more thing. I also raised the issue of our embassy in Moscow, which operates under very difficult conditions. I raised that because it's important. It's going to be very difficult to engage in communication with Russia about anything if our embassy is not functioning. And he raised concerns about his diplomatic mission in the United States. So at a very basic level, if in fact there is going to be an opportunity here to pursue peace by engaging with the Russians, we're going to need to have functional embassies in Moscow and in Washington, D.C. And that's certainly something foreign ministers would talk about as a matter of normal course.
I want to ask you about what happened in Munich, Germany at the security conference. Vice President Vance gave a speech.
Geopolitics and international relations
that the threat he worries about the most is not Russia. It is not China. He called it the threat from within, and he lectured about what he described as censorship, mainly focusing, though, on including more views from the right. He also met with the leader of a far-right party known as the AfD, which, as you know, is under investigation and monitoring by German intelligence because of extremism. What did all of this accomplish other than irritating our allies?
Well, why would our allies or anybody be irritated by free speech and by someone giving their opinion? We are, after all, democracies. The Munich Security Conference is largely a conference of democracies in which one of the things that we cherish and value is the ability to speak freely and provide your opinions. And so I think if anyone's angry about his word, they don't have to agree with him, but to be angry about it, I think actually makes his point. I thought it was actually a pretty historic speech, whether you agree with him or not. I think the valid points he's making to Europe is we are concerned that the true values that we share, the values that bind us together with Europe, are things like free speech and democracy and our shared history in winning 2 world wars and defeating Soviet communism and the like. These are the values that we shared in common. And in that Cold War, we fought against things like censorship and oppression and so forth. And when you see backsliding and you raise that, that's a very valid concern. We can't tell them how to run their countries. He simply expressed in a speech his view of it, which a lot of people frankly share. And I thought he said a lot of things in that speech that needed to be said. And honestly, I don't know why anybody would be upset about it. People are allowed, you don't have to agree with someone's speech. I happen to agree with a lot of
We get
what
it. You're talking in circles, bro.
With someone's speech to at least appreciate the fact they have a right to say it, and that you should listen to it and see whether those criticisms are valid.
We're done. Goodbye, Gremlin.
To all of the Maoists who are excited about America's demise, American hegemony finally ending after basically essentially uncontested since the end of the Cold War and largely still the dominant force following World War II, perhaps the American century has come to a close. NATO is in disarray after the U.S. announces that its security priorities lie elsewhere. Phenomenal stuff. Yeah, Hegseth, how long is that speech?
President Zelensky, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
And Georgia's import-based economy could be hit hard with the Trump administration's announcement yesterday about a new set of tariffs on the auto industry. But now President Trump turns his focus overseas. The administration is looking for ways to end the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. CBS's Willie James Inman has more.
President Trump waved to the crowds as he arrived at the Daytona 500 NASCAR race on Sunday. Trump's second presidency is hitting the gas on a number of fronts, including efforts to bring Russia's war on Ukraine to a close.
We're moving along. We're trying to get a peace with Russia, Ukraine, and we're working very hard on it. It's a war that should have never started.
2 U.S. officials tell CBS News that a delegation, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, will take part in discussions this week in Saudi Arabia.
What we have right now is a call between Putin and President Trump in which both sides expressed an interest in ending this conflict. I imagine there will be follow-up conversations to figure out what a process to talk about that would look like.
On Sunday, Rubio met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. The Secretary of State reiterated that Hamas cannot remain in power in a post-war Gaza.
As long as it stands as a force that can govern, or as a force that can administer, or as a force that can threaten by use of violence, peace becomes impossible.
The unequivocal support of the United States on Gaza will help us achieve these objectives faster and set us on a path for a different future.
President Trump has said he wants the U.S. to take control of the Palestinian territory, with residents leaving for Egypt and Jordan, an idea both countries have rejected. This week, an international delegation is set to meet in Cairo for talks focusing on the Gaza ceasefire agreement.
Our Ukrainian minister said a delegation from Ukraine has arrived in Saudi
Ukrainian
Arabia for
minister.
meetings, but a Ukrainian advisor said Ukraine and Russian representatives would not meet directly.
People that...
Oh boy, here we go. President Buckwheat.
So Daytona was fantastic. The crowd was amazing. The people love that sport, and they're wonderful people that run it. And they had a little rain delay, but we'll go home and watch it, I guess. Or some of you will, and others will try and create peace throughout the world. Do you have any questions, please?
Sir, did you speak to Secretary Rubio this morning?
I did.
What is the latest with the negotiations in Saudi Arabia? What's he thinking?
We're moving along. We're trying to get a peace with Russia, Ukraine, and we're working very hard on it. It's a war that should have never started.
Do you expect Zelensky to be involved in these conversations? What will his role be?
I do. He will be involved, yes.
Mr. President, would you allow Europeans to buy U.S.-made weapons for Ukrainians?
Yeah.
Sir, Zelensky said today that Russia is going to wage war on
Who's a little
NATO.
baby?
Do you agree with that? Do you have any concerns
No,
about?
I don't agree. I don't agree. Not even a little bit.
Vice President Vance said that the United States would potentially take military action against Russia if they won't come to an agreement. Do you agree with that stance?
I don't know if that's what he said. I don't think he said that.
Based on your conversations with President Putin, what do you think he wants ultimately in Ukraine?
I think he wants to stop fighting. I see that. We spoke long and hard. Steve Witkoff was with him for a very extended period, like about 3 hours. I think he wants to stop fighting. They have a big, powerful machine. You understand that. And they defeated Hitler and they defeated Napoleon. You know, they've been fighting a long time. They've done it before. And but I think he'd like to. I think he would like to stop fighting.
Do you think he wants the whole of Ukraine, or just what do you think he wants?
No, I think he wants to stop. That was my question to him, because if he's going to go on, that would have been a big problem for us, and that would have caused me a big problem because you just can't let that happen. I think he wants to end it, and they want to end it fast, both of them. And Zelensky wants to end it too.
Sir, when do you think that can actually happen? When do you think the fighting can stop?
Well, we're working to get it done. I mean, you know, it's too bad it started. It would have been a lot easier to end it before it started, right? But it started because we had an incompetent
Thought it was making
president
noises,
that-
so I wanted to make sure
didn't
he
know what
wasn't
was doing.
throwing up or something. Hope he's gonna be okay.
That should have never started. That war was so easy to stop. Remember this, that under Bush, they took a lot. Under Obama, they took a lot. Under Biden, they're trying to take the whole thing. And under Trump, they took nothing. Nothing was gone. Not even a little bit. So it's too bad. It's really too bad. A lot of people are dead right now that should be alive, and a lot of cities are destroyed that can never come back like they were. Those beautiful golden domes and all of the multicolored domes that were 1,000 years old, they're all laying in, you know, just shattered. So it's very sad. They ruined the culture.
They're beginning phase 2 of the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. What's going on there? Have you been briefed on the latest related
Well, I
to
told
that?
you I have been briefed. I told Bibi, you do whatever you want because, you know, my statement was they got to come back. Now, the reason I made that statement because they said they weren't going to deliver, they were not going to deliver the people that they said they were going to deliver, that they agreed to deliver. And they did agree to do that, but they broke that agreement. When I made the statement, they delivered everybody plus an American. Now, the good news is they look like they're in pretty good shape because the people from the week before didn't look like they were in good shape. They looked like Holocaust survivors, frankly. Horrible. Whatever happened to them was horrible. But that'll be up to Israel what the next step is.
How much, if any, do you blame Bush
consultation
and
with me.
Obama for not doing enough regarding Ukraine?
Oh. Weapons that you've now allowed to be shipped. Given the fact that there's this ceasefire supposed to be in effect, why those
Peace through strength.
Obama's more responsible than Bush. Bush was coming in when Russia was putting signs up that it was going to be a new era. So you can't blame him for giving Russia a chance and trying to work things out and not like being hard with them. But Obama, people were so against the wars going on that he was too scared to actually do hard things.
Strength. You understand that, right? It's called peace through strength. You know, they contracted for those weapons a long time ago in the Biden administration, and then Biden wouldn't deliver the weapons. but I look at it differently. I say peace through strength. They were sitting there. Nobody knew what to do with them. They bought them. But I believe in that very strongly.
So do you have an update on European Union is talking about banning food imports from the U.S., kind of along the lines of the reciprocal
Why is that? Why?
Reciprocal tariffs. They don't like the
That's all right. I don't mind. Let them do it. Let them do it. They're just hurting themselves if they do that. I can't imagine it, but it doesn't matter. We're having reciprocal tariffs. Whatever they charge, we charge. Very simple. If a certain country like India, which is very high tariff, if they charge us X dollars, we charge them X dollars. It's all right. It's a fair thing to do. Even the media said it was fair. And it's going to be very good for the United States.
Do you have an update on your timing of your meeting with Putin in Saudi Arabia?
No, there's no time set, but it could be very soon.
Like this month?
Well, it'll be soon. We'll see what happens. But they're meeting right now. And that's more. I mean, this should have been done 4 years ago, 3 years ago before it started, but it should have been done immediately after it started, as opposed to now, 3 years later.
Sir, egg prices have reached an all-time high. What's your
Which is what?
Egg prices have reached an all-time
Well,
high.
there's a clue. I mean, it was a long, before I ever got here, it was at an all-time. This didn't start. Remember, I've been here for 3 weeks. And when you saw the inflation numbers, I've been here for 3 weeks. I have had nothing to do with inflation. This was caused by Biden. I had 4 years of virtually no inflation. So I'm just taking over. But I'll tell you what, this country has made more progress in the last 3 weeks than it's made in the last 4 years. And we're respected again as a country. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Are we? By certainly not by all the people you just talked shit about in Europe at the security conference there, pal.
Donald Trump's love of disruption and loyalty has been the name of the game this term. But how could that affect national and international security?
That's a good question about the
Is Canada
corruption.
at greater
I'm not
threat
sure.
now than under previous administrations. Joining us to discuss this is former senior CSIS official
I can only
Dan
look at
Stanton.
what we have
Dan,
now
so
and
much
say
to talk
that
about on
Obama
national security. Thank you for
should have
joining
done
us.
more. You know, it's something that maybe in
You
the
look
time
south
I
of
would
the
have agreed
border,
with him.
and, it's just all of the things are going on at once down there through your lens of experience. How would you describe to Canadians what is happening inside the U.S. national security establishment right now?
Well, it's very sad what we're seeing unfold. What's happening essentially is Trump is degrading the efficiency of the U.S. intelligence community, breaking up the FBI, buyouts to the CIA, other agencies as well. And that is basically positioning the United States for another 9/11. And by extension, Canada's vulnerable. So a weakened national security from the United States impacts on us, and it's just horrible to watch.
There's a lot of concern about Trump's relationship with Russia. He last week talked about settling the war between Russia and Ukraine without Ukraine at the table, just sitting down with Russia. Of course, Tulsi Gabbard, the now confirmed director of national intelligence, has said things in the past that have been clearly supportive of Putin. How do you interpret that relationship between the Trump administration and the Russians, and what it will mean for allies like us?
Well, it means an awful lot. First of all, Ms. Gelfard has, been sympathetic towards Putin, has been sympathetic to Snowden. And so a lot of the values we share and things we have in common in terms of national security are being upended in the United States. And so when you also look at the United States with their president moving into a rather friendly way with Vladimir Putin, you've got to look at all the intelligence equities there as well. A lot of the allies, including Canada, have been working against Russian intelligence, have been working in support of the Ukraine. And so that will impact on sharing with the United States, because the priorities are going to shift.
I look at our northern border in the Arctic, and the reality is that we are very close to Russia if you go north, geographically speaking, and a lot of concerns there for Canadian national security, especially with some of the things that Donald Trump has said about Canada becoming the 51st state, and, well, if we're going to pay for your defense, then we're going to take over, essentially. But one of the concerns that we've been hearing is the possibility that the U.S. could cut off intelligence sharing with Canada. Obviously, the U.S. has a huge network of eyes all over the world. There's some concern that could jeopardize jeopardize Canadian national security. People are saying, what if they don't warn us when they find out there could be a terrorist attack? Do you see that as a scenario that could play out?
I don't see that as a likely scenario in terms of what we call security intelligence, which is terrorism and espionage. Canada does receive a lot of what we call non-threat foreign intelligence. This is political reporting, economic reporting that the U.S. agencies provide to the government of Canada to shape various foreign policies. Some of that could be cut back. Some of that could be spun a little bit. But the lion's share of the security intelligence, which we get on weapons of mass destruction, terrorist attacks, espionage, spies, I seriously doubt any of that would be cut back. Because the people working in these agencies, American intelligence, are professionals. They're not robots. They don't immediately shift in terms of focus and priority just because of a change in leadership in Washington. And so if there's going to be let's say a terrorism threat in Canada, it's highly unlikely that the Canadian government is not going to get that information from their U.S. partners.
Is there a world now where we see the tremendous assets and capabilities that the United States has in things like listening, spying, being turned against Canada as an ally to accomplish Donald Trump's goals?
The potential's there. Last week, Wall Street Journal, there was an article quoting an aide to John Radcliffe, who's the new CIA director, and he said directly that the United States government will very likely be targeting countries in the Western Hemisphere using espionage to support the president's trade policies. So that translates into the U.S. could very well target Canada, government, private sector, to get information to support tariffs, any subsequent trade war. And that's new in terms of a Five Eyes partner using all their architecture, all their resources of intelligence against Canada. It's something we need to watch for.
And what would that look like in terms of the kinds of capabilities that they might use to spy on Canada and get economic information?
Well, it would be hard from what we call human. It'd be hard, for example, the CIA to cultivate Canadians, let's say in the government, to commit treason for Donald Trump. That's less likely. But if we look at agencies like the National Security Agency, the SIGINT Agency, and some others, some of those resources could be directed at Canada, Canadian Telecommunications.
So they could be listening to phone calls or emails?
They could. It's conceivable. Now, it's going to take a long time to do that. It also depends how much MAGA ideology seeps down into the core business of those agencies. But I think in some ways the U.S. government has telegraphed that possibility in this battle we have over tariffs.
So you could have a situation where the president tells the National Security Agency, which monitors, phone calls, whatever, up here, they can monitor us because we're Canadians, there's no restrictions. We want you to listen in to the Prime Minister, or we want you to listen to major industries and how they're calculating, intercept that information, and then use it to essentially get ahead of us in the chess game.
Absolutely. Look at Ms. Merkel's phone in 2013 with the Snowden revelations. The NSA had listened to Ms. Merkel's personal phone. That had absolutely nothing to do with national security. That's what we call foreign intelligence, non-threat related, using their resources to serve the national interest as defined by Donald Trump. I think it's a possibility.
One of the things that the Trump administration has been doing is getting rid of some of the most experienced intelligence operators in the CIA and the FBI, offering buyout packages, now starting to push people out more actively. What effect could that have for global security, especially as the U.S. is talking about dealing with Russia closely, being in Gaza, taking over there and operating, the possibility of U.S. troops moving in there, and now you have the people who remember the war on terror perhaps no longer there at all?
It's a terrible prospect. What he's doing is terrible because you're going to have people who don't know what they're doing going into management positions in these agencies, and we're going to lose our eye on the target. So all those threats, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Russians, Chinese, so on, there's a risk that coverage is going to be disrupted as those agencies are turned inside, directed at Americans. Look what's going on to the FBI. It's just heartbreaking. They're breaking the organization up. They're driving people out. They're potentially prosecuting special agents who worked on the January 6th investigation. So that also means American capability on, for example, counterterrorism is being reduced. And that's making the world a more dangerous place, and that has implications for Canada.
What does Canada need to do to prepare for this very different and potentially more dangerous world.
Well, I suspect on the operational level and our intelligence agencies is still business as usual with the Americans. But we do have to keep an eye out for, at some point, there may be a shift, and those resources of what has been an ally could be directed at us. It would take a while. My question would be, how long will it take for that MAGA ideology to seep into those agencies, or people just get fed up and leave, and then you actually have those resources used against Canada?
Are they fairly resilient, those agencies, to various ideologies from different presidents?
Historically, the agencies are very resilient. They're very good culturally at withstanding interference. Even with a new director or a chief, they can still maintain that core business independent of that. But what's happening is there are appointments that are going below that executive level in various agencies.
There certainly is, and uncharted waters ahead for Canada.
Yeah.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, Mercedes.
And we begin this Sunday morning with President Trump's efforts to help end 2 wars in this, his 4th week in office. And ahead of tomorrow, day 500 of the Israeli hostages in captivity in Gaza. Hamas this weekend released 3 more Israeli hostages, including the last living Israeli American, after the terrorist group initially said it would postpone the release, claiming that Israel violated the terms of the ceasefire agreement. The reversal coming after President Trump threatened Hamas that if all the remaining hostages were not released by 12 p.m. yesterday, quote, all hell is going to break out. The first phase of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas set to end this month, with little known about any progress on the terms of the second phase. That phase was supposed to bring the return of all hostages in exchange for the release of a total of 1,700 Palestinian prisoners who committed real crimes, as well as Israel's withdrawal from Gaza and a permanent ceasefire. The bulk of the progress in the release of the hostages so far happening in just the last 3 months, after U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, traveled to Israel, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar to meet with mediators in this conflict, drawing up plans to end the war on Israel and released all hostages. And reports this morning that Witkoff is now planning to join other Trump officials to begin efforts to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, with talks expected to take place in Saudi Arabia this week. Joining me now in this Sunday Morning Futures exclusive is the man himself, U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. Steve, thank you so much for all of your efforts, all that you have done, and thank you for joining us right now.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Maria. Thank you.
Before we get to Israel and Hamas, let me get your take on your plans in Saudi Arabia. Are you expecting to leave for Saudi tonight? And what specifically are you hoping to accomplish?
Well, I don't want to talk too much about that specifically, Maria, but I am going tonight. I'll be traveling there with the National Security Advisor, and we'll be having meetings at the direction of the president, and hopefully we'll make some really good progress with regard to Russia, Ukraine.
Is there anything you can say about some of your allies alarmed by the fact that Ukraine is not part of the talks?
Well, I think Ukraine is part of the talks. The president had their president, Zelensky, on the phone this past week. I am pretty sure that a lot of our cabinet people, including Treasury Secretary Bessent, the Vice President, Mike Waltz, John Radcliffe, our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, have been meeting with various Ukrainian people at the Munich Security Conference. So I don't think this is about excluding anybody. In fact, it's about including everybody.
And final question on this. Do you expect Ukraine will have to give up a significant portion of its land? And do we believe that, if so, Putin will be done after this?
You know, those are details, and I'm not dismissive of the details. They're important. But I think the beginning here is trust building. It's getting everybody to understand that this war does not belong continuing, that it should end. That's what the president has directed us to do, to negotiate a proper ending of this war. No more death. There's been too much already. That's what he said. And that's the direction, and that's what we're going to do.
Let me move on to Israel. You've done such an incredible job in terms of getting some of these hostages home. Tomorrow is the 500th day that the hostages have been in captivity. Will there be a phase 2? Have the terms been drawn up there?
Well, phase 2, Maria, phase 2 is a little bit more complicated than phase 1. But phase 2 is absolutely going to begin. I've actually had calls this morning, I can tell you, with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with Prime Minister Mohammed from Qatar, and as well with Director Hassan from Egypt, who is their Director of Intelligence. And we had very, very productive and constructive calls this morning about the sequencing of phase 2, setting forth positions on both sides so we can understand where we level set where we are today, and then continuing talks this week at a location to be determined so that we can figure out how we get to the end of phase 2 successfully.
Do you expect phase 2 to include the release of all of the hostages? And Steve, how many of those hostages do you believe are still alive?
Well, phase 2 includes 19 IDF soldiers. We believe all of them are alive, and some others too as well. It includes Edan Alexander, who of course we've been pressing for because he is an American and Israeli citizen as well. So it includes all of these people. It also includes getting families back, the bodies of members of their family who have died, so that they can properly be able to mourn for them today and in the future. So it includes all of those people. It just is a little bit more intricate and complicated in terms of how we bring the two sides together on this, because phase 2 contemplates an end of the war, but it also contemplates Hamas not being involved in the government and being gone from Gaza. So we've got to square those two things.
Steve, you are the first American official to visit Gaza. Can you share with us a little of what you have witnessed? I mean, it must be mentioned the fact that, 1,700 Palestinian prisoners are expected to be released, some of whom have committed serious crimes, tried to commit terrorism on the world, and they're being released. The people who were being released and the hostages in Gaza were going about their lives at a concert. Can you tell us a bit about what you witnessed, including seeing some of those caves and tunnels?
Sure. Well, so Maria, I felt it was important for me to go to Gaza. And why? Because phase 1, the execution of phase 1 was an accomplishment. It brought a lot of people together who needed to work hard to get that accomplished. But what was always going to be more complicated was the implementation of phase 1, which meant the Netzarim line, the Philadelphia corridor, how people are crossing, how they were going to be, how security procedures would be instituted. And a small little blow up on phase 1 could have ended all of phase 1. So we so far have been able to successfully navigate that. And I felt that there was no way to navigate it unless somebody was actually on premises in Gaza. What I saw there was alarming. It's completely devastated. And that begs the question, should people be allowed in there in those sorts of dangerous conditions? Thank God we've had no incidents, but there's 30,000 unexploded shells throughout Gaza. And the buildings are all down. It's utter destruction. There's all kinds of issues. This affects, by the way, phase 3, which is the theoretical reconstruction of Gaza. We're going to have to get to a reconstruction, but the devil will be in the details on the master plan, on how we examine everything subterranean, which has been blown up. So lots of issues with that. With all of that said, I also saw a film of what happened on October 7th, and that was a horrific film. So I've got some context, and that was important for me to have.
And given those 30,000, all of the shells that were unexploded, you've said that this area is uninhabitable. And President Trump has said that you just can't go back there. You would never send your children there, knowing that you've got all these potential shells that could explode. As a result, President Trump said that the U.S. will own Gaza. you've had some pushback from some regional leaders there. I guess Egypt is coming up with its own plan. But from your background as a real estate professional, give us your sense of why you believe that is, in fact, a viable result.
Well, let me say this, Maria. First of all, as usual, the president comes out, says something new and unique. He gets attacked for it. By the way, that happens when new and unique proposals come to the fore. But it also encouraged a lot of conversation. So now we have the Egyptians saying we have a plan. The Jordanians are saying we have a plan. And people are actually engaging in really important, cogent discussion about what ought to happen there. The president, first and foremost, and he's a real estate person by training too, and I went into the business because of him. He inspired me. Who wouldn't want to be like Donald Trump? So, but the president's position is, why are we going to necessarily default to a policy prescription that has been, where the same policy prescription has been implemented for the last 4 or 5 decades and it hasn't worked? So maybe we need to explore new policy prescriptions that ultimately end up in a better life for Gazans and Palestinians. And I think it's as simple as that. And it's very, very sensible. For some reason, people have a problem with him saying things like that, but he does.
One of which is Michael Rossi, who is the professor of, well, he's an expert in comparative politics, Russia, Eurasia, and we've had him on the show, I think, for the best part of a year at this point, and he's been very supportive. And the second gentleman, Professor James Kerr-Lindsay, who is an expert on statehood in country, things like that, he will be joining us in just a minute, and he's also an expert on Kosovo and the Balkans. So I'm very delighted to have 2 expert people of this kind. Now, keep in mind, for those of you who are on Michael's channel or James's channel, this is a conversation, it's not an interview. So I will be talking a little bit. So I know some of you, particularly from Michael's end, think that I'm a waffly old twat who doesn't know enough information about stuff, but there we go. So anyway, Michael seems to like talking to me. So anyway, there we go. The drama's out of the way, and we are now being joined by Mr. Professor James Lindsay as well, who
there we go.
His audience doesn't mind me as much. But anyway, my name is Piotr, this is the Global Gambit, and we do co-stream these shows on an intermittent basis, and delighted to be able to bring these gentlemen together as well. But anyway, so we're going to stream for 90, 120 minutes. I could just say 1.5, 2 hours, but anyway, and see where it goes. We obviously are going to focus, I think, on Munich, JD Vance, Trump, the developments over NATO more broadly, and then that plays quite well into, I think, the Kosovo elections, K4, and we may also touch upon the Middle East if the 2 guys so wish to, because there's obviously been developments down there as well. If you have questions and comments, then do drop them into the chat box. I will be reading them out, and if you say some very nasty and lovely things, then I probably will highlight you for everybody as well. Public shaming, I think, is quite fun. Anyway, Michael, how are you? James, how are you? I'm coming from Madeira, Portugal. You guys are you're in Tashkent, right, Michael?
I'm in Central Asia, back, it's basically my 3rd home at this point, so, yeah.
And James, you're in the long-bedded good old Cyprus, right?
Yes. Over in Cyprus, enjoying some decent weather as compared to lots of other parts of Europe and things at the moment. So, yeah. Okay, so, strange times. What can I say?
I mean,
I think Tariq has put it most adequately. Shall we start with this question, because I think this kind of theme is going to run through a lot of the show. If you have questions, guys, I will be saving them and listing them later on. We're going to have a bit of a general back and forth, I think, and then we'll answer some of your questions. So do post them. But yeah, I don't know, guys.
This is the question. I mean, does Europe have a future?
Right? This is largely the question.
Where they control their own security. I'll take a crack at it and say, I'm sure that there are those in the EU and even some in NATO that would like to have this, but that's just not how things are built right now. If anything, what we get, the thing that we get out of the Munich security conferences is that this one is probably almost as famous or as infamous as the 2007 one that Putin had spoken at, which usually means that it's the outliers that come in, give some, controversial speech that leaves everyone, stunned, wondering what is going on. I mean, J.D. Vance's speech at the security conference put this very question up at the front here. Does Europe have a future where they control their own security? In the sense that the United States has kind of said that Europe needs to get its act together. And by getting its act together, it needs to fall in step with American foreign policy. Along with this is coming the Trump-Putin conversation, the 90-minute conversation that was had over the phone. The transcripts, to my knowledge, have not been disclosed. The Kremlin has been rather mum on the details, but Trump has effectively said that he and Putin spoke at length, came to a number of preliminary conclusions, and ultimately decided the fate of a sovereign country that was not on this call. When Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials at Munich voice their opinions, they were kind of what did I miss something here?
Why is he saying Putin like that? Tyler's already pissed off with you, so he doesn't like you saying Putin correctly. I think he wants you to say Putin because he's a poo head.
Or I can be like an American and just say Putin like that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what can I say? It's called Putin. I mean, what do you want me to say here? But in other words,
you're being an Italian mafia boss now. What do you want from me? Yeah?
What do you want? What do you want from me? I mean, ultimately, I was just going to say, and I'll hand it over to to James.
Yeah, I want to hear what James says. We're not going to do
monologuing. I mean, ultimately, Ukraine is just kind of playing pickup, trying to figure out what is going on and whether or not they have a place or a voice at the negotiating table.
James, what do you think?
I mean, it's
how bad. Let me rephrase the question. How bad do you feel?
I think like a lot of others, just very shell-shocked at the moment by this. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary. Look, in some ways, I think we shouldn't be as surprised as because this was signaled quite long in advance that this was what Trump had in mind. I think a lot of us felt that, well, maybe once in power, things would calm down a bit. And of course, all the signs from what's going on internally have said completely the opposite. And then Vance turning up, Hegseth saying what he said as well. But it's just that idea that just had that conversation. It didn't seem to inform any European allies. Didn't say, look, I've got this. I want to have a conversation with Putin. I am now president. I said I was going to do this. And so just went ahead and did it. And then the extraordinary thing, of course, was saying, and Trump and others signaling what had been effectively some of the core parameters that, as a lot of people have noted, should have been part of the negotiations. He conceded fundamental points even before going in. So it wasn't just bad that he picked up the phone and said, Vladimir, let's have a conversation. And by the way, the idea of doing reciprocal visits, this is just, it is absolutely extraudinary. And
so James, let me stop you there then. Let me interject then, because I want to show you your, shall we say, the resident multilateralist. I think I'm in the middle between you and Michael. Michael, you're more on the sort of realist, you have a different, I think, stance on sort of the war in Ukraine versus, say, Jonathan Fink of Silicon Curtain, who we had on, a year ago, and you guys were debating a bit. But, I think I'm somewhere in the middle, right? I want, like you, Michael, James, excuse me, to have that belief that, internationalism, cooperation, all that sort of stuff. But we're clearly not in that world, right? And I'm showing this thingy, for example. So Carl Blindt is the co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations, right? A well-known European think tank. He is he's an elite in the traditional sense and the globalist sort of idea that a lot of people are sort of anti. But he was sort of he said similar to what you said, James, which is practical Europeans stunned / shell shocked. My question to you, James, as I asked Carl quite bluntly, is why are you stunned? This has been on the cards. This has been telegraphed for months, a year. We knew this was coming. Why are Europeans still stunned that the VP would say, we're ditching you, you're on your own? That's what was inevitable. If Trump won, we knew that this was going to be the situation with Ukraine. All it illustrates for me is a continued complacency, or I don't know, sticking in the head of your head in the sand kind of mentality of European capitals. I don't know.
No, I think to clarify, I'm not stunned that this has happened. I'm stunned at what seems to have been proposed.
I see. Okay, fair enough.
And I am stunned at the absolute fundamental lack of awareness. And one would only hope in some ways it's lack of awareness rather than sort of malice aforethought.
What, lack of awareness by Trump or who? Or
by Trump and those around him as to what
Trump.
exactly they have just done.
But it's Trump. Why are you surprised? Why is that? This is him. This is how he operates.
But I mean, this isn't just Trump just saying art of the deal and everything. And I want to. The idea that Russia will walk out of this with any sort of recognized sovereignty over Ukraine is the thing that will finally kill the post-1945 international order. That's not hyperbole. That's not exaggeration. That is absolutely what it is. We have an international system, and I always say, and I know that some people will humph and hubs. But the reality is,
calling about Professor Lindsay, he hasn't been on that long.
With a couple of notable exceptions, I'll put in the caveat. Since 1945, we have an international system that is built. It's written in the UN Charter, respect for the territorial integrity of other states. Now, this is the moment that all the Serbian heads explode and everything like that, but let's park that. For all sorts of reasons.
He does this every time, guys. He always takes.
Yeah, but you've got to, because otherwise it's just but it's all right. So
let's park Kosovo and Serbia for a time being.
I acknowledge that is an issue, but by and large, this has held up, and it has held up remarkably well, and it's provided a lot of international peace and security. The fact that states cannot unilaterally just change the borders by invading the territory of neighboring states has been a linchpin of international peace and security, not just European peace and security, international peace and security. It actually, and I always make this point, the place where this has been most successful has been Africa, where you've got 70 odd countries, lines on maps drawn by colonial powers. Those lines on maps drawn by colonial powers have been remarkably resilient. There have been very, very few territorial wars in Africa because that principle has held up, and it's held up in a lot of other places as well. And what Trump is just basically saying is that that principle is now open to debate. And it's obviously not just what he's been doing in terms of talking with Putin about, some sort of territorial agreement for Ukraine. But it's the whole fact of what he's been saying about Greenland. It's what he's saying about Canada. It's what he's been saying about Panama. All of this is extremely dangerous. And people would say, but it's just Trump bluster and everything like that. Okay, maybe he isn't planning to invade Panama. Maybe he isn't planning to invade Greenland, but he is absolutely normalizing the idea that you can lay claim to the territory of other states. And this is then the next step forward that comes on from it.
Well, it's
saying to Russia, we will accept that you now control parts of Ukraine, and Ukraine, Europe, just suck it up, because
it's a return to use of hard power. It's a return to might is right. I made a video on this very topic actually for people who want to view it, but it was about the fact that you could argue a neo-imperialism is somewhat here, as Thucydides said. The strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must, or whatever the exact quote is, right? But we're in this world now where the big powers, if you want to call them that, for different reasons, are just carving up the world as they see fit, and the role of weaker states basically are kicked around by the bigger powers. And Ukraine is one, Kosovo is another. I think your point on Africa, James, is really apt, because obviously we've got this situation in South Africa, the DRC, and the civil war down there is getting really bad. And the one thing that I note is that whenever I talk to African colleagues or engage in African spaces and conversations, Africans are very set. They may not agree with everything the West does, but they're very set on this post-45 order, whereby they respect and uphold the existing borders that they now have, even if it's across racial, ethnic lines, because they realize that they're very much pushing this order. And it's fascinating because, that was it. The AU elections are being held, right? The African Union. And I think it's so indicative of how the countries that helped create the system are abandoning it, whilst the ones that came out and benefited from it or were emerged because of it are now the ones who are the biggest advocates and upholders on it. How much of an irony we seem to be. Michael, you haven't said anything, so I'm sure you have some points.
Well, I mean, I obviously agree 100% with what James has said regarding Ukraine.
Just James. Okay.
I'm listening to James's comments about really, I mean, what it ultimately boils down to is exactly this: is the peace terms are going to involve, at least from Trump's point of view, a revision of Ukraine's borders. And yes, obviously, we can say that the so-called sanctity of borders has not been completely honored since 1945, right? This is the time for everybody who is either on Team Serbia or Team Kosovo to interject. The difference, though, is that with Kosovo, and I've made my case for Kosovo, I think, pretty clear. I think that it was, a hastily and illogical decision. But we're not talking about a territory that goes from one country to another country, like from Serbia to Albania, but creating a new entity all on its own with very, very clear parameters on multi-ethnic consociationalism. When it comes to Ukraine, this is literally a country invading another country, laying claim to territory, with many just conceding the reality that this is a foregone conclusion. Ukraine cannot get its territory back. Forget about even Crimea. And it's not so much that Trump is the only one suggesting to recognize the revision of borders in Russia's favor, but it's been one of those things where certain analysts, certain policymakers, certain academics over the years have questioned the very notion of the sanctity of borders, where James has said, and I absolutely agree with him, that since 1945, borders are sacrosanct. The borders may have been artificially drawn at some point, but we make peace with the reality of the day and we move forward. And yet, even as back as the mid-1990s, when Yugoslavia was breaking up, there were many. I believe even Mearsheimer was one. He had penned an opinion piece, I believe, I could be wrong, along with Stephen van Evera in the New York Times, that had said, what is wrong with drawing new borders? Effectively, give Republika Srpska to Bosnia, give Herzegovina to Croatia, form some rump Bosnian state, partition Kosovo, give this to Albania, give the rest to Serbia, call it a day, right? Mm-hmm. Call it a day and, sort of accept the realities, the real realities that are on the ground. Obviously, this editorial went nowhere because if we are to open the debate about whether or not borders can be redrawn, which is exactly what's going to happen if this Ukraine peace deal goes through, well, then it raises the issue not just in the Balkans, but in the Caucasus, in Africa, in Moldova, in Central Asia, I mean, just wherever. I mean, the good people at Rand McNally are going to be very, very busy over the next few years, redrawing the borders of the world atlases. So I think what, the crux of the matter, I think really the big issue here isn't so much the ceasefire proposals that Trump had proposed, which ultimately effectively just gives Russia almost everything that it already wants. I mean, there's really no bargaining whatsoever here. And forget the fact that Europe had largely been, if not entirely, ignored. The big issue is very much, will there be a redrawing of borders? And in this case, it's more than just simply Kosovo, which is a partially recognized entity anyway. If Kosovo got into the United Nations, that would be one thing, but Kosovo was a parastate, as we've talked already before. Ukraine we are talking about ceding territory from one sovereign country to another. And if that is the case, well, then the doors are open for all kinds of revision. And so in this case, right, I am absolutely on the same page as James and many others who argue that this just creates a major precedent and just a security dilemma for multiple hotspots down the road.
Yeah, I've just posted in the chat the interview, or an actual interview I had with Michael about parastates, because I think we use Kosovo as an example of that. And since we seem to be referencing Kosovo a lot, I think we should bring them in soon. But I wanted to break down a little bit, James, your thoughts as well. There are different. Trump has one idea of a peace plan. The Finnish president has proposed his. Alexander Stubb has proposed his. I think there is a general consensus. It's just consensus that negotiations need to begin, right? And then a second stage, sort of, Alexander, the Finnish prime minister, is emphasizing signing, I'm just reading it here, signing a ceasefire agreement, demarcating the border and establishing international monitoring. During this period, there would be a prisoner exchange and the return of children abducted. If the aggressor attacks again, Ukraine would be automatically admitted into NATO. The third stage, ensuring Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and internal territorial integrity. Okay, that third point's a bit nebulous. How? Who's going to administer that? I think a lot of it does come down to, I don't know, James, I'll phrase my point as a question for you, which is that Vance had sort of said pretty candidly, pretty crudely that, they want something from Ukraine if they're going to continue to support them. And I think I sit on the area that, if Trump feels Putin is trying to screw him over, which Putin is, Trump will revert and up support. Said they wouldn't cut out military potential. The Wall Street Journal, I think, reported this. They wouldn't cut out potentially military foot soldiers in Ukraine, right? So this is a test of Putin's resolve to try and squeeze as much as he thinks he can from Trump, when Trump's effectively like, well, as you have both said, being a nice guy and giving him everything without any consolation. So, could we see an actual increase of military presence in America if things were in Ukraine, if things weren't to go Putin's way? Trump feels that was a really poorly worded question for you. But I don't know. Do you get it?
I mean, so I spent my career working on conflict resolutions. I've been involved in peace processes, informal, formal, and I think it's and I've made this point many times before. I think we all want to see an end to the fighting, but there are a lot of people who I think are very misguided about the implications of just ending the fighting and what exactly is going to be agreed, because this, I do believe, is what we would call a systemic war. This has the power to change the international system. And so it needs to be thought out in a very different way than a lot of other
quoting a stupid person making an apt point.
Interstate situations, let alone intrastate civil wars and things like that. So I think there is a lot of nervousness about what is being talked about at the moment, and is this going to come down to sort of redrawing borders? But there are a whole range of other factors that do need to also be considered. The point that was raised about the abductees, especially the children, and that ties in with another question. Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for the actions in Ukraine, along with someone else. And one of those, the key things that is being leveled against him is the abduction of children, which under the Genocide Convention constitutes genocide. You know, it's as simple as that. He is facing charges of genocide.
He's spitting. He's absolutely spitting.
Because of what he's done in Ukraine. There is questions of reparations. Who's going to pay for the enormous damage that's been done? And it might be the case that Trump just says, well, look, we'll do a deal with Vladimir and then everything will be normal and we can start trading. Europe is going to have to think really long and hard about what this means because, you know, I was thinking about this a lot today. One of the great failings, I think, of the West in many ways in recent years, and we've seen this in Ukraine, is it hasn't brought along the rest of the world with it. So there have been a lot of countries which have been quite happy to trade with Russia, despite all the sanctions that have been put on it. India is the one that really comes to mind, but of course China has been fundamental in all of this. What happens then if the United States says, well, we're now happy to deal with Russia? Does Europe end up being the last party that's holding out on that, and the implications of that? That is enormous. That will do very real damage in Europe, and there will be a lot of people who will be saying, well, maybe we should. So it really does pose an existential question for how Europe is going to deal with a number of real issues. You know, again, the United States has made it clear that it's not interested in the International Criminal Court. The fact that Trump was willing to welcome Netanyahu, who has also been indicted by the ICC, was very indicative of that. If we have the sight of Vladimir Putin pitching up in Washington, in all sorts of ways, this is going to present Europe with some very, very real questions about how it's going to be dealing with Russia. And I now, in that light, there is a lot of people who are saying that what we have seen this past few days with Vance's statements at the Munich Security Conference is probably the most significant moment in international relations, certainly for the West, since 1991, and some have said since potentially 1945. And I absolutely believe that, because we could see a fundamental parting of the ways now between the United States and Europe on a whole range of core security questions. And so I think that the fact that now we see, and I know we'll probably move on to this, that Macron has called this meeting of European leaders to discuss what next to do in Ukraine. I mean, this really is unbelievably significant as a meeting, and some very, very hard decisions could potentially be taken. Not least of all, is it possible to just sideline Trump and just say, look, we will continue our support for Ukraine and up it, and then you do have a fracture in NATO and between the West and Europe, and between Europe and the United States. And it is now looking increasingly likely that then would simply turn around and Trump would say, fine, you're on your own.
So let's take a step back for a second, right? I tried to say that twice and was on mute because I just wanted to listen to James for a second. No, I mean, look, I think I want to make... I feel, James, that you're clinging onto something that is just the new. That's why I called this Europe's new reality, right? This is it. But also it's not forever. At the same time, maybe I'm trying to cling too much. I'll phrase it this way. So we have this president for 5 years. Okay. In that time, what is the damage limitation that the Europeans can do to minimize disruption to transatlantic relations and try to, I don't know, mitigate as many risks as possible whilst upping? I think the biggest emphasis here, as someone who wants to believe in the idealisms of the UN and many of those things, that's why I worked in it, that's why I do believe in it, but I'm also a pragmatist. And the reality is that we are on our own. And therefore, Europe needs to pull its finger out, to quote my father, lovely expression, and do something. And so many of our leaders are not doing something. They are reacting with, oh, that's outrageous. They don't give a shit, guys. They don't care about your feelings or your reactions. They are focusing on America now. And therefore, the reality of a multilateralist, values-based, Western-styled system is not necessarily dead, but it's certainly on life support for the next 5 years. And I think that unless Europe gets its shit together seriously, I agree with you, right? And you said earlier also that the Ukraine war is a systemic war because it could have. It is, right? I think it's a systemic war that has fundamentally fractured and arguably ended the primacy of the United States and Western-led system, at least for the past 30 years, right? We're in a new
he did other forms of genocide, but
of international order right now.
James is just making the most obvious case.
What's the word that Ian Bremen likes to use? Zero.
Like, you can't debate that it happened there.
G0, there is no pole of power anymore. I think we're firmly in it now. Trump's only accelerating that through his own destructive policies. But at the same time, I guess Europe, we have to play with the hand we've been dealt, if that makes sense. And I as I said, I want us to believe that the European Union, democracy, rule of law, all these things will be sustained, but they are going to be severely undermined. And therefore, this is the opportunity for Europe to be that, I'm sounding a bit idealistic now, but be that bastion of everything that we like to think of Europe and the US being, right? The US is not doing it anymore. It's engaging in power politics with the Chinese and the Russians, carving up territory, threatening smaller states, doing what they want to seek their own, access to resources, land, and whatever. So Europe, therefore, has to be pragmatic, but it can also still be like, if you want a place where we're going to respect all the things that have been since the Second World War, this is the place for you, sort of thing. So I'm sounding a bit preachy, but I don't know. I agree with you 100%. I don't want things to change, but that's the way they're going. We can't stop it.
Yeah, I want
that, right?
Pass over to Michael, but I just want to say again, I think there's several things to unpack here. What I was saying is trying to explain why, certainly to my mind, this is an inflection point. Why it is quite as serious as it is, because some would say, well, it doesn't necessarily have to break with the United States, but I was just outlining exactly why it potentially does. The other alternative, of course, is Europe just turns around and says, we can't afford to have a break with the United States. We'll just go along with what Trump has decided.
Well, that's what's British.
And that would be, that would be disastrous. And I think there would be a lot of countries in Europe which would feel very, very nervous about doing that. I mean, I was listening to something this morning saying the Baltic states, Poland have been very careful in how they've been treating Trump and his statements. But let's not be in any doubt, they're appalled and horrified by what he's been proposing. And I think there would be real problems if it was a question of, do we just fall into line with this and give Putin exactly what he wants? So that's, again, I mean, it's not that I'm speaking from a position of idealism. Yes, I do believe in transatlanticism.
So do I. I just think we have to be realistic with the state of it for the next 5 years, is what I'm saying, right? We have a choice in Europe. We can either completely get outraged with Trump, distance ourselves, which ultimately will not be that useful, or we have to bite the bullet, deal with him in a way that benefits us but also doesn't alienate him too much, be it through trade, commerce, whatever, transactionalism, whilst trying to chip away at him and be like, don't forget though, democracy has benefited you, Trump. You have to, I don't know, because the option is, if we don't, then rule of law and everything you're saying really is on dead. If we try to be a little bit more tactful and strategic in the way that we go about it, I think that we could replenish it after Trump's gone, depending upon the state of the United States. If Vance doesn't suddenly try to become president and running in 2028 or 9 or whatever, right? Perish the thought. So sorry, I know I keep interjecting.
No,
I know you've got chance to say. Sorry, because I'm passionate, because I'm going to be.
Okay, I'm very tired. I might be back in a few hours, but I at least need to take my nap. And it's 3, so this is when it's slow anyway. So maybe in 3-4 hours I'll be back to finish this.